Hello YouTube, Louie here. I'm over on Zero Hedge, and I have got an article here that I think is worthy of a read for those of you who despise the fiat monetary system and believe that the world is heading in the wrong direction. Well, here is The Man Who Vanquished Gold, article by Tyler Durden. I'm going to read this real quickly and see what your thoughts are on this man. The flood of obituaries that noted the passing of Paul Volcker last week have almost lauded his achievements as Fed chair, 79 to 87, in reining in double-digit inflation that ravaged the U.S. economy in the 1970s. Volcker was referred to as the former Fed chairman who fought inflation, inflation tamer, and full-fledged inflation warrior, and the Fed chairman who waged war on inflation and led the Federal Reserve's brute force campaign to subdue inflation. Mr. Volcker certainly deserves credit for curbing the great inflation of the 1970s. However, he also merits a lion's share of the blame for unleashing the great inflation on the U.S. and the world economy in the first place. For it was Mr. Volcker who masterminded the program that President Nixon announced on August 15, 1971, which unilaterally suspended gold convertibility to U.S. dollars held by foreign governments and central banks, imposed a fascist wage price freeze on the U.S. economy, and slapped a 10% surcharge on foreign imports. Tragically, by severing the last link between the dollar and gold, Volcker's program scuttled the last chance of restoring a genuine gold standard. More than 2 years before Nixon slammed down the gold window, Volcker, the recently appointed Undersecretary of the Treasury for Monetary Affairs, gave an oral presentation to Nixon and his closest advisors on U.S. balance of payments problems. The presentation was based on a memo that the secret Volcker group, initiated by Henry Kissinger, spent 5 months preparing. Among other things, Volcker recommended a continuation of capital controls to prop up the inflated dollar's overvalued exchange rate and a massive appreciation or revaluation of the currency of less inflationary countries such as the West Germany, placing the burden of adjustment to unrestrained U.S. inflation on these countries. Volcker then planted the time bomb that would eventually detonate and seal the fate of the gold standard. He suggested to Nixon that these measures did not work to sustain the pseudo-gold standard of the Bretton Woods system. A run on U.S. gold stock could only be avoided by unilaterally repudiating the post-war U.S. pledge to convert foreign official dollar holdings into gold. Unfortunately, the Volcker Group report summarily dismissed the alternative of raising, possibly doubling, the dollar price of gold. Devaluing the dollar, which would have increased the value of U.S. gold stocks and facilitated the restoration of a genuine gold standard. Only a real gold standard could have halted and reversed the slow-motion collapse that the international monetary system had been undergoing since the mid-1960s due to a large and persistent U.S. payment deficit driven by profligate dollar creation. Volcker, however, hated and wanted to get rid of the last vestiges of the gold standard and replace it with a fixed exchange rate system dominated by the U.S. fiat dollar to further enhance the power and prestige of the U.S. in international affairs. According to Volcker, the stability and strength of our currency was important to sustaining the broad role of the United States in the world. Years later, Volcker revealed, "I have never been able to shake the feeling that a strong currency is generally a good thing, and that it is typically a sign of vigor and strength and competitiveness." One of his biographers intimated that Volcker's long-standing regret at having been rejected for military service during World War II because of his height was at the root of his single-minded determination to maintain the supremacy of the American dollar as the world premier currency. Indeed, Volcker struggled mightily to make the dollar appear strong, even while rampant money printing to finance Great Society welfare programs in the Vietnam War inexorably weakened it. But Volcker bitterly opposed raising the price of gold because he feared that the open devaluation of the inflated dollar would not only diminish the status and reputation of the U.S., but also reward people and countries he detested, namely speculators in gold and gold-producing countries such as the Soviet Union and South Africa. He especially loathed and wanted to punish President Charles de Gaulle and the French for embarrassing and discrediting the U.S. by withdrawing from NATO and exposing the weakness of the dollar by insisting on converting their dollars into gold in the face of U.S. threats to remove military protection against the Soviet Union. To add insult to injury, de Gaulle had sent naval ships to retrieve French gold. When a full-blown run on U.S. gold stock appeared imminent in the early 1971, Volcker prepared a memorandum for the new Treasury Secretary, former Texas Governor and master political operative John Connally. The memo contained three main proposals. First, countries with less inflationary monetary policies, and therefore balance of payment surpluses, such as West Germany and Japan, would be imposed upon to substantially appreciate the value of their currencies, thereby encouraging U.S. exports and stiffening its imports while sparing it the embarrassment of openly devaluing the dollar. Second, Volcker recommended a preemptive strike against gold in the form of a cold-blooded suspension of gold convertibility. Volcker's final proposal was a temporary wage price freeze. As one of Volcker's biographers characterized his motivation, he wanted America to act preemptively to avoid appearance of defeat at the hands of the currency speculators. Secretary Connally brought into Volcker's program when a severe dollar crisis struck a few months later. He used all of his substantial political wiles to persuade Nixon of the merits of the Volcker plan. Then Fed Chairman and Nixon advisor Arthur Burns, for all his erroneous monetary ideas and policy failures, was convinced that gold should play, at least a nominal, in a central role in the international monetary system. In fact, after Nixon took office, Burns proposed to end the balance of payment problem by increasing the official price of gold, which would have effectively devalued the dollar. In Burns' view, this would maintain gold as the anchor of a fixed exchange rate system, an outcome that Volcker would have detested. Not surprisingly, Burns was troubled by Volcker, who he thought had given a stupid reply to Nixon about raising the price of gold. Burns also recognized and bemoaned Volcker's influence over Connally. Somehow, poor and wretched Volcker, never knowing where he stood on any issue, had succeeded in instilling an irrational fear of gold in his tyrannical master, whom he tried constantly to please by catering to his hatred of foreigners, particularly the French. Unfortunately, Burns had badly underestimated Volcker and had mistaken his tact and tactic compromising for vacillation and indecisiveness. As his biographer noted, Volcker, in the end, the wily Connally-Volcker axis prevailed over the politically naive Burns. Burns' biographer clearly recognized Volcker's political cunning in winning over Nixon. Well, there you have the article. So, gosh, I'm curious about your thoughts about this. As we see, the gold window was closed right around 1971, and they were credited for reining in inflation, at least temporarily, but it was the 70s that saw inflation spike to upwards of 14%. So clearly, the devaluation of the dollar that Nixon feared was going to happen one way or another. You know, it is when you print too many dollars and you have too much spending, you have to devalue the base currency. And you can play games with the comparison of U.S. currency to foreign currencies, but in the end, you get what you deserve. So I thought it was also interesting in this article that they were worried about the appearance of the U.S. dollar taking a hit all at one time by revaluing gold. Of course, there is no gold standard anymore, and the government does not officially set the price of gold. So these fears are not the same today as they would have been back then, but I think it's worth taking note that how the government is concerned with how the dollar looks, and they don't really want to take preemptive actions that would overnight show the weakness, pardon me, of the dollar. And I think we're very likely to see this kind of a scenario again, and Nixon could have revalued, doubled the price of gold in 1971, and let's just say that, that would have been 100% inflation in the dollar. But look what happened every year, 6, 8, 10. We averaged 8 to 10 to 12% for quite a few years. In the end, the dollar was devalued by half or something along that magnitude. It's also funny in my memory that I always, being a Republican, or at least I used to be, I always used to blame Carter for the inflation years that happened. But really, you have to go back to LBJ, Kennedy, the Vietnam War. Nixon was just the executioner, if you would, of the plan, and although I think he made a mistake and Volcker made a mistake, really it is the spending that occurs that creates inflation and debases your savings. And you have to go back to the people who spent the money, because wherever it blows up, it may blow up on someone's watch, and I suspect that is going to happen again, perhaps if we get a different party in power. We will blame the Democrats maybe for when this thing blows up, but you have to go back to the spending patterns of the previous administration to show who planted the seeds for the explosion and the devaluation of the dollar. I'm going to leave it there, but I think there's some good information here, and perhaps it is instructive to what might happen in the future. But excessive spending begets excessive inflation and devaluation of the dollar. And the government is more likely to boil that frog gradually than it is to take a hit all at once. And that's the parting shot I will leave you with. Would love to hear your thoughts. Do you remember these guys in the inflation of the 70s? Did you make a lot of money on the inflation of the 70s by buying a home for $10,000 and having it appreciate to $50,000 by the end of the decade? That's worth noting as well. And gold, of course, the price of gold, it reacted in its own way. I guess we could quickly take a look at the gold chart over the same period of time. All right, here we are with the chart of gold prices versus inflation starting in January 1971. Gold is the inflation-adjusted gold price. Well, that's a little harder to comprehend here, but the core CPI, the red line, here we see it spiking 12 to 14%, and at the same time, the inflation-adjusted gold price going from approximately 100 upwards of 800. So we see the inflation hit gold as well. You don't just have to buy property and stocks. Inflation will ultimately adjust gold. But then the gold prices came back down and inflation, continued to steal your money. So there was a period here where you wanted to be in gold, and there was a long period where you wanted to be out of gold, especially during, imagine that was the Reagan years. But that's enough information, I think, for one video. Please let me know your thoughts, and if you think we're headed for a repeat, or how will it be different this time. All right, guys, have a wonderful weekend. Louie out.